In the Imperium of man, faith is fire. It is the sacred furnace that burns in the heart of every citizen, the only light that cuts through a galaxy drowned in war and darkness. Yet that same fire, so bright, so revered, can consume entire worlds in a single breath. One word from the ecclesiarchy, one accusation of heresy, and a planet becomes ash in the void, its people sanctified in smoke. To the Ministorum, this is not murder. It is mercy. It is purification. It is the will of the Emperor carried out with holy conviction. But behind every Exterminatus order lies a choir of screams and a cathedral of silence. There are no debates, no chances, no salvation for those judged unworthy. Faith alone decides their fate. And when the robed cardinals and screaming preachers call down divine fire, they do so not as soldiers, but as zealots, believing utterly and without doubt that the Emperor demands this sacrifice, that to hesitate is to betray him. This is not about strategy, it is about belief. And belief in the Imperium can be deadlier than any weapon. The Ministorum's wrath did not erupt in a vacuum. It was born in fire, tempered in betrayal, and sanctified through 1,000 years of escalating horror. To understand why the ecclesiarchy destroys entire planets in the name of faith, we must trace its lineage back to the darkest chapters of imperial history, and none is darker than the age of apostasy. During that time, the ecclesiarchy, then a rising tide within the Adeptus Terra, fell into madness under the rule of Goga Van Dyer. He was not a mere High Lord. He was the ecclesiarch and the master of the administratum, wielding both religious and secular power in an iron grip. Under Vandier, the ecclesiarchy's obsession with loyalty turned into a lust for dominance. Planets were scoured for descent, entire sectors bled dry, and death became a liturgy. It was during this epic of terror that the Ministorum first practiced annihilation, not as a punishment, but as devotion. Even after Van Dyer's fall, his legacy endured. The reign of blood was a lesson seared into the Ministorum's soul. Never again would the ecclesiarchy be denied absolute control over faith. The decree passive, signed by Sebastian Thor, sought to limit their military power, banning the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. But as always in the Imperium, interpretation is everything. The Ministorum found its blade in the orders militant of the Adepta Sororitas, a loophole cloaked in piety. They might not raise armies of men, but they commanded sisters clad in ceramide and flame, avatars of wrath who enforced the faith with relentless fury. With the Sororitas as their enforcers and the imperial creed codified across 1,000,000 worlds, the ecclesiarchy grew into something terrifyingly absolute. They were no longer merely priests. They were arbiters of purity, and the scale of their authority expanded to match. Where once an archdeacon might excommunicate a man, now a Cardinal Astra could pronounce damnation upon entire star systems. Every schism, every deviant sect, every whispered heresy was a spark threatening the powder keg of the Ministorum's divine order. This transformation wasn't just political, it was theological. Heresy to the Ministorum was no longer error. It was contagion, taint, a sickness that could not be cured, only cauterized. And in the eyes of the ecclesiarchy, entire populations were susceptible. Children, workers, nobles, it didn't matter. If a single thought broke from the catechism, it could spread like a rot. The only response was fire. Consider the Thorian Schism, where theological debate over the Emperor's divinity escalated into a full-blown rebellion. The world of Thor had worshipped the Emperor as a god long before it became dogma, and their deviation, ironic though it was, led to Exterminatus. The planet's soil now floats as irradiated rock. The faithful perished alongside the heretics. In the Ministorum's reckoning, this was not excess, it was perfection. Such logic is echoed throughout imperial history. The apostasy of Gaius Helmar, the cult of the divine flesh on Helican subsector, the Montauk heresy. Each conflict ended not with conversion or diplomacy, but obliteration. The destruction served two purposes. It silenced the heresy and sent a message to all others who might question the creed. Every charred planet became a sermon, every scream a benediction. The ecclesiarchy also learned to wield spectacle. Public acts of destruction were not hidden but celebrated. Pilgrims gathered to witness orbital bombardments. Saints were canonized for ordering the deaths of billions. The sermons of flame were broadcast across systems, burning doubt from the minds of the faithful through awe and terror. The mass killing of heretics became not just a method of control, but a form of worship. And the most harrowing truth: many within the Imperium welcomed this. To countless citizens, the Ministorum's fury is not madness, it is reassurance. The galaxy is a cruel and uncertain place, filled with xenos, demons, and traitors, but the ecclesiarchy offers clarity. In their fire there is purpose, in their executions there is meaning. Better to burn than to fall into corruption. Better to be judged and found wanting than to be seduced by the warp. This is the twisted comfort that the Ministorum provides, the illusion of certainty in a universe that offers none. This is why planets die, not because of strategy, not because of resources, but because faith demands it, because in the ecclesiarchy's eyes, to allow heresy to persist is to betray the Emperor himself. And that is a sin that can only be answered with fire. In the Imperium, belief is not passive. It does not rest quietly in the soul or lie dormant like a sleeping ember. It is sharpened, wielded, and loosed upon the galaxy like a holy weapon. This is the essence of the ecclesiarchy's power, the transmutation of faith into fire, of doctrine into death. It is one thing to believe, but another entirely to make belief your blade. The Ministorum has perfected this transformation. The Imperial Creed is not a gentle faith. It was never meant to heal or redeem. It is a bludgeon, a hammer meant to shatter anything that diverges from its singular vision. To believe in the Emperor is not enough. One must believe in the correct way. And the Ministorum alone holds the authority to define that way. Their scripture becomes law. Their sermons become battle cries. Every pulpit is a command post, every church a potential bunker, and every preacher, no matter how soft-spoken, is a potential executioner. This weaponization of belief begins at the lowest levels of imperial society. From birth, citizens are immersed in the litanies of the creed. They repeat them daily, often mindlessly, but always with fear. They are taught that deviation is death, and that to question is to sin. Over time, this indoctrination forges not just obedience, but complicity. The laity begin to police each other, driven not by malice but by devotion. Neighbors denounce neighbors for an ill-spoken word. Children inform on parents. Inquisitors may not even be needed. The Ministorum has taught the flock to eat its own. But this is only the foundation. The true weaponization of faith lies in the mobilization of violence under its banner. The Adepta Sororitas are the ecclesiarchy's most visible sword, warriors clad in power armor, chanting hymns as they burn worlds in the Emperor's name. But they are not alone. Across the galaxy, missionaries, confessors, and redemptionist fanatics incite wars of purification with terrifying ease. They descend on planets and begin their sermons. They preach of divine wrath, of cleansing flame, of the Emperor's gaze. They identify heresy, often arbitrarily, and the purging begins. Faith in this context becomes a form of armor. Once a cardinal declares a people heretical, the Ministorum no longer sees them as human. They are a moral threat, a spiritual disease, and thus their deaths are not war crimes but rituals. Each act of violence becomes sacrament, each scream a chorus in the ecclesiarchy's grand hymn. The cities that fall, the millions that die, they are testimonies of faith, writ in ash and blood. What is perhaps more terrifying is the sheer scale at which this can occur. In the Imperium, information travels slowly, and truth is often a matter of perspective. A single missionary on a backwater agri-world might declare a local tradition heretical. That judgment filters upward, distorted and exaggerated. By the time it reaches the ears of a distant ecclesiarch, it may sound like full-blown rebellion. An Ordo Hereticus agent is summoned. A strike force of Sisters of Battle arrives, and within a solar month, the world burns. The original heresy might have been a misinterpreted gesture, a regional prayer misunderstood. But once faith is set ablaze, it is nearly impossible to extinguish. And the Ministorum does not act alone. It often draws upon the might of the Imperium to enforce its declarations. Imperial Guard regiments are redirected. Fleet assets are commandeered. The Inquisition is invoked, but it is the ecclesiarchy that lights the match. Their authority is spiritual, yet it casts shadows over entire systems. They do not need to command armies directly. Their words do the work for them. There is no negotiation with this kind of belief. Once a world is deemed unclean, no apology, no offer of penance can forestall the fire. The Ministorum sees mercy as weakness and weakness as heresy. This absolutism allows no room for doubt, no tolerance for nuance. A governor who questions a sermon is suspected. A scholar who cites an unapproved text is damned. A priest who hesitates in judgment is branded a traitor. And behind each of these micro-decisions looms the specter of planetary death. Even the imperial military often fears the ecclesiarchy's influence. Battle fleet commanders have refused orders only to be replaced or executed. Planetary governors have appealed for clemency, only to be ignored. The Ministorum's authority does not stem from force alone, but from ideology. They shape the moral framework in which the Imperium operates. And in that framework, to burn a world is not a crime. It is obedience. This is how the Ministorum wields belief as a weapon, not through guns or tanks, but through a theology so rigid, so utterly unyielding, that it demands extermination as its most devout expression. The destruction of a planet is not merely accepted, it is celebrated. It is the ultimate offering, the final hymn, a cathedral of corpses built to honor the God Emperor of mankind. And in that terrible logic, faith becomes the deadliest force in the galaxy. Among the darkest tools at the Ministorum's disposal lies a singular word, Exterminatus. It carries with it the weight of divine authority and the finality of absolute destruction. In the wider Imperium, it is a military sanction, the irreversible cleansing of a world beyond redemption. But within the ecclesiarchy, it is something far more sacred. It is ritual. It is exorcism. It is the ultimate act of faith when prayer becomes fire and judgment falls from the stars. To outsiders, Exterminatus might seem like a bureaucratic decision. It is, after all, a sanctioned process. It must be authorized by high-ranking officials, inquisitors, chapter masters, lords militant. But for the Ministorum, it is less a command and more a sacrament. It is not about whether the planet poses a threat strategically. It is about whether it offends the divine. Heresy is not measured in guns or fleets. It is measured in sin. And when sin grows too thick, the only cure is death. The theological justification is both terrifying and elegantly simple. A world that falls into heresy is already lost. Its people are spiritually dead, its soil tainted, its atmosphere saturated with falsehood. To allow such a world to persist is to risk infection, not biological but ideological. The Ministorum teaches that heresy is like warp corruption, unseen, insidious, and fatal. It cannot be isolated. It cannot be contained. It must be eradicated. This is why Exterminatus for the ecclesiarchy is not merely acceptable, it is beautiful. The tools of death are transformed into relics of sanctity. Virus bombs, cyclonic torpedoes, orbital lance barrages. These are not weapons. They are instruments of salvation. When launched under the Ministorum's banner, they are often blessed, anointed with sacred oils, inscribed with verses of purgation. The act itself is preceded by sermons, hymns, and invocations to the Emperor. It is not war, it is liturgy. The world dies not in silence but in song. There are recorded cases where entire ecclesiarchal congregations gathered aboard battleships to witness the death of a heretic planet. They wept with joy, raised censers to the heavens, and chanted litanies of redemption as the world cracked and burned beneath them. For them, it was not genocide, it was deliverance. The ultimate proof that their faith had meaning, that their creed was truth incarnate. And what of the people on the planet? Often the line between heretic and innocent is deliberately blurred. The Ministorum rarely makes distinctions. If a governor falls to heresy, his entire domain is damned. If a single city births a cult, the planet is tainted. The idea that the innocent must suffer for the sins of the few is not a failing of ecclesiarchal doctrine. It is its very core. Suffering is seen as purification. Martyrdom is sanctified. To die by exterminatus is, paradoxically, a form of absolution. The fire cleanses all. This is why the ecclesiarchy does not hesitate. There is no place in its heart for mercy. Mercy is a poison that delays righteousness. To question the need for exterminatus is to doubt the will of the emperor, and to doubt, even for a moment, is to walk the path of heresy. Thus, the chain of escalation is swift. A whisper becomes a rumor becomes an accusation, and an accusation becomes a funeral for billions. In the rare instances where exterminatus is withheld, it is usually due to the interference of other imperial branches. The Astra Militarum might want to reclaim the world, the Adeptus Mechanicus may value its resources, or the Inquisition may see a use for the population. But the Ministorum never forgives such reprieves. It remembers, it watches, and often it waits for the opportunity to finish what it began. One of the most infamous examples of ecclesiarchal exterminatus is the destruction of Calfine Primaris. The world had flirted with a philosophical doctrine that emphasized inner reflection over external worship, a deviation from the prescribed worship of the emperor. Though the planetary rulers remained loyal in word, the Ministorum found their practices dangerously introspective. Faith without fear, the Cardinal Astra proclaimed, is arrogance in disguise. The world was burned, its libraries turned to cinder, its people vaporized in holy fire. No enemies had landed, no chaos cults had risen. It was destroyed because its soul was impure. This is the crux of the ecclesiarchy's use of exterminatus. It is not about physical threat. It is about metaphysical offense. Worlds that challenge the creed, however subtly, are seen as tumors. They must be cut out, even if it means excising an entire organ from the body of the Imperium. To those who witness such acts from the outside, to the rare few who are spared, who orbit above, who live to tell the tale, it leaves a scar deeper than any battlefield wound. They do not remember strategy or victory. They remember the hymns, the unshakable devotion in the eyes of those who gave the order, the solemn, exultant voice that declared, "Burn them all, that their souls might be pure." In the hands of the ecclesiarchy, exterminatus is not the end. It is the beginning of legend, of martyrdom, of sacred terror. It is the voice of the God Emperor speaking through flame, and once it is spoken, there is no world, no cry, and no heresy left behind. Only silence, only ash. Death in the Imperium is not feared. It is revered, romanticized, glorified, until it ceases to be a consequence and becomes a goal. This is the heartbeat of the martyr's doctrine, the belief that death in the Emperor's name is not only acceptable but desirable, the holiest fate one can achieve. For the ecclesiarchy, martyrdom is not a tragic end. It is the sacred consummation of faith, a final gift to the Emperor's eternal war. And in this twisted sanctity, the seeds are sown for planetary immolations, not just tolerated but worshipped. From the grand basilicas of Terra to the dust-choked chapels of the outer systems, every prayer reinforces the message. To die for the Emperor is to live forever in his light. This is not metaphor, this is dogma. Saints are canonized for dying well, for refusing to renounce the creed even as they burned. Pilgrims reenact their deaths in rituals of fire and blood. And the ecclesiarchy, in its insatiable hunger for devotion, teaches that such death can be magnified. If the death of one martyr is holy, then what is the death of a billion? A planetary martyrdom becomes a galactic hymn, echoing across the stars. Entire worlds have been guided into willing annihilation under this doctrine. The ecclesiarchy identifies a deviation, a drift from orthodoxy. They proclaim that the planet has been tested by the Emperor, and the only way to prove its faith is through death. And people believe it. Trained from birth to see suffering as divine, they accept the judgment with terrifying calm. Some weep with joy, others sing hymns as they march into the pyres. They see themselves not as victims, but as chosen ones. Consider the world of St. Beryl's Reach. Isolated and devout, its people followed a variant of the creed that emphasized silence and meditation. It bore no ill will toward Terra, no heretical alliances, no corruption. But silence in the eyes of the ecclesiarchy was suspect. Faith unvoiced was faith unproven. When the missionaries came and found no raucous sermons, no cries of glory, they reported blasphemy through omission. The Ministorum's verdict was swift, redemption through fire. The people, when informed of their fate, did not resist. They saw the coming doom as ascension. They decorated their homes, dressed in ceremonial robes, and met death as a choir. The world burned, and the ecclesiarchy praised its devotion. This is the horror of the martyr's doctrine. It erases the line between murder and sanctity. It turns annihilation into liturgy. And the more grotesque the death, the more glorious the tale becomes. It is not enough to die quietly. One must die visibly, painfully, dramatically. The ecclesiarchy crafts its saints from ashes, writes its scriptures in agony. Each new martyr adds to the myth, fueling the cycle. This cycle is perpetuated not only by clergy, but by the laity themselves. The faithful are taught to yearn for martyrdom, to see suffering as the highest form of loyalty. In the face of planetary doom, some organize self-immolations. Others form sacred choirs that sing until the last breath. Parents offer up their children as symbols of unbroken faith, and the Ministorum, watching from orbit or behind pulpit, blesses them with tears and incense. Of course, not all die willingly. There are screams beneath the hymns. There are rebellions crushed beneath prayers. But the martyr's doctrine conveniently ignores these. Dissenters are labeled as false martyrs, those who die in shame, not glory. Their deaths are not recorded. Their names are erased. The ecclesiarchy constructs history with ruthless selectivity. Only the loyal are remembered. Only the faithful become eternal. The most chilling aspect is how deeply this doctrine permeates the soul of the Imperium. Even outside the Ministorum's direct influence, the culture of martyrdom thrives. Imperial Guard commanders quote martyr saints as they send soldiers into hopeless charges. Planetary governors order last stands to inspire the next generation of saints. And on every world, shrines stand not to victories, but to deaths. To the self-immolated priest, the penitent who accepted execution, the child who sang as the bomb fell. For the ecclesiarchy, the deaths of billions are not statistics. They are verses in a sacred epic. They are the fire that keeps the emperor warm on his golden throne. And so long as this belief endures, the flame will never go out. It will consume more worlds, more lives, more souls, all offered up willingly, joyfully, in a galaxy where to burn is to believe. This is the terrifying power of the martyr's doctrine. It sanctifies the most unimaginable horrors. It makes extermination beautiful. It makes murder divine. And it ensures that the Ministorum, armed with scripture and sanctity, will never run out of worlds to burn. Heretics are rarely discovered. More often they are declared. In the eyes of the Ministorum, heresy is not merely the rejection of faith. It is deviation, silence, innovation, or even misinterpretation. It is found not only in the unrepentant chaos cultist, but in the farmer who forgets a litany, the noble who funds an unauthorized chapel, the child who misquotes scripture. And once that label is given, heretic, it spreads like fire, not only through belief, but through fear. This is the reality of witch hunts in the Imperium, not spontaneous moral crusades, but cold, calculated tools of ecclesiastical domination, scaled to the level of entire planets. The Ministorum's witch hunts begin not with evidence, but with whispers. A missionary reports a troubling deviation. A confessor notes a disturbing question. A lay brother stumbles upon an unfamiliar prayer. These may be honest observations or political tools. It matters not. The machinery of investigation lurches to life. The office of the Holy Inquisition may be called, or the Order's dialogues may dispatch scholars to uncover linguistic heresies. But more often, the ecclesiarchy handles such matters internally, and internally their process is swift and merciless. Once a hint of heresy is found, it is rarely investigated in isolation. The doctrine of spiritual contagion asserts that heresy cannot be compartmentalized. It spreads like rot. Thus, one heretic implies a dozen implies a cult implies planetary deviation. And suddenly, a world is no longer innocent. It is diseased. It is suspected. Its people are watched. Its leaders are interrogated. Its churches are razed. And always, there is fire. Witch hunts are spectacles as much as they are purges. The ecclesiarchy uses them to reinforce obedience through terror. The trials are public, often preceded by days of sermons about faith and sin. The accused are rarely allowed to speak. If they weep, they are feigning innocence. If they remain stoic, they are mocking the creed. If they confess, their heresy is proven. If they deny, they lie. It is a trap in which the only escape is death, and even that death is used as proof of guilt. Planetary governors often acquiesce to these hunts out of fear. To question the Ministorum's judgment is to place oneself under suspicion. And so, they nod, they cooperate, they hand over their people like lambs to the altar. It is safer that way. Safer to burn 1,000 strangers than risk one accusation upon yourself. Safer to watch your neighbor's chapel burn than to wonder whether your own prayer book is fully compliant. The psychological warfare of these witch hunts cannot be overstated. The ecclesiarchy thrives on confession, not truth. The more people it breaks, the more it justifies its own sanctity. Entire districts may be forced into confession by threat of bombardment. Families denounce each other. Children are rewarded for turning in their parents, and all of it is framed as spiritual cleansing, the fire that purges doubt from the collective soul. And yet, this madness is not chaos. It is structure. Every accusation, every trial, every torch lit is backed by precedent and scripture. The Book of Litanies provides guidance on identifying heresy based on facial expressions. The Catechism of Flame outlines appropriate punishments by degree of deviation. Even the color of robes worn during a trial is specified: red for known heretics, white for suspected apostates, black for those whose heresy is ideological, not material. It is bureaucracy weaponized against the soul. Entire worlds have been consumed in this fire. On Fansel Saku, a planetary poet published verses interpreted as a metaphor for divine absence. Within a year, the entire planet was under inquisitorial lockdown. Over 12 million were executed for implied atheism. On Virilia, a folk dance mimicked a gesture once associated with an extinct cult. The ecclesiarchy ordered an immediate cultural purge. When local leaders hesitated, orbital bombardment commenced. These are not outliers. They are patterns. It is not always clear whether the ecclesiarchy believes in the heresies it claims to fight. Sometimes, it seems obvious that the accusations are political, a means to remove rivals, to assert dominance, to secure resources. But within the Ministorum, belief and strategy are indistinguishable. To doubt is heresy. To question is disloyalty. Thus, every witch hunt is real because it must be real. If the heretic does not exist, one will be created. And perhaps the most chilling reality is this: witch hunts do not require the ecclesiarchy to be physically present. Once the seed of fear is planted, planetary societies often turn on themselves. The Ministorum may send a single confessor to a hive world, and within months, millions will be dead. The local populace, desperate to prove its purity, will burn its own libraries, execute its own leaders, rewrite its own history. The Ministorum need only light the first match. These are not anomalies. They are systemic. They are taught. They are encouraged. Every world burned for heresy becomes a warning to others. Every heretic slain affirms the righteousness of the flame. And through it all, the ecclesiarchy smiles. For in their doctrine, doubt is worse than death. And death, when given in faith, is never in vain. There are names whispered across the stars that carry with them the weight of entire civilizations turned to ash. These are not names of warlords or generals, but of priests, orators, and cardinals, men and women whose voices rang with such conviction that the galaxy itself bent in terror. They did not wield bolters or command fleets. They wielded belief, honed to a monomaniacal edge, and through their sermons alone, they condemned billions. The madness of these ecclesiastical zealots is not an aberration. It is celebrated. In the golden halls of the Ministorum, fire and fanaticism are indistinguishable from sainthood. One of the most notorious was Cardinal Zaphon of Dalthus Gamma, known for his eyes, which never blinked during his sermons, and his voice, which never cracked even as he pronounced death upon the innocent. Zaphon rose through the ranks by uncovering heresies no one else saw. In every mural he found hidden blasphemies. In every prayer, a mispronunciation he claimed was a demon's name. Entire districts were purged under his guidance, but it was his condemnation of the planet Gestorn that marked his legend. The world was loyal, its tithes paid, its people devout. But Zaphon, during a planetary visit, claimed he heard echoes of sedition in the soil. He gave a single sermon, 20 minutes long. The next day, the world was engulfed in holy fire. His sermon is now taught in seminary as the Tongue of Flame. Then there was Oratrix Heliania, a preacher whose voice could shatter glass and whose faith was so intense that even Astartes paused to listen. Her path to infamy came during the Scriptorum Wars, when a schism broke out over scriptural interpretation of the Emperor's dreams. Heliania declared the opposing sect not misguided, but utterly damned. She traveled system to system, preaching that the heretics must not be argued with, but eradicated. Her sermons did not simply inspire, they incited. Angry mobs burned libraries. Planetary governors bowed to her fury. When the planet Cathera refused to ban a disputed volume, Heliania broadcast a planetary sermon from orbit. By its end, half the population had set fire to their own homes in an act of collective repentance. The survivors begged for Exterminatus. It was granted. Heliania did not weep. And there is always the shadow of Arch-Cardinal Luridin, the man whose piety bordered on madness, and whose obsession with ritual purity led to one of the most infamous purges in ecclesiarchal history. Luridin believed that heresy could be carried in breath, that words spoken in doubt could taint the air itself. He enforced what he called the silent catechism on 12 worlds, banning speech entirely during worship. Those who coughed, who breathed too loudly, who dared to utter an unauthorized syllable, were burned alive during Mass. When one of the worlds, Selphine, rebelled against this madness, Luridin accused the entire population of intellectual arrogance. A heresy, he claimed, was worse than chaos worship. He signed a declaration of faith that included coordinates and an Exterminatus request. It was approved without question. What is truly harrowing is not the extremity of these figures, but how they are revered. Zaphon's relics are paraded through the streets of Harren's Belt. Heliania's voice recordings are used to indoctrinate sororitas novitiates. Luridin's silent catechism has become a tool for planetary re-education. These orators did not act in isolation. They were the natural fruit of a tree watered with centuries of sanctioned fanaticism. Their madness is not disowned by the Ministorum. It is codified, enshrined, and propagated. There are less famous but no less deadly examples. Local confessors who turned entire city blocks into execution camps, preachers who sparked pogroms with a single accusation, high ecclesiarchal judges who issued damnation from vox thrones, indifferent to the tears and protests of planetary rulers. The common denominator among them is unwavering conviction. Not one expressed doubt, not one showed regret. They believed utterly, and their belief destroyed worlds. These figures also served another purpose, as examples for the faithful. Their lives, or more often their deaths, became part of ecclesiarchal myth. Their sermons are memorized, their judgments quoted, their actions used to inspire new waves of zealots who seek to emulate them. And in doing so, the Ministorum ensures that the cycle of madness continues. For every Zaphan that dies, 10 more rise. This elevation of religious zeal to divine authority is what makes the ecclesiarchy so terrifying. It is not just that they can destroy planets with words, it is that they believe those words are sacred. That destruction, when done in the Emperor's name, is the purest form of devotion. That madness is not a failing, but a virtue when sanctified by dogma. In a galaxy where the warp twists minds and chaos whispers lies, one might expect such fanaticism to be feared. But in the Imperium, it is embraced. These mad orators are not aberrations. They are beacons, and the faithful march behind them, even if the road leads only to fire. Devotion within the ecclesiarchy is a competition of agony, a never-ending race toward extremes where the prize is not salvation, but purity, or the illusion of it. This self-consuming spiral, often called the purity spiral among the more cynical voices in the Inquisition, is not officially acknowledged by the Ministorum, but it exists, it festers, and it devours. As each priest, cardinal, or preacher strives to outshine the last in piety, the acts required to prove one's faith escalate. What begins as fervor becomes fanaticism. What begins as zeal becomes genocide. And entire planets are the currency by which this sanctity is purchased. The spiral is simple in function and monstrous in outcome. The Ministorum does not reward moderation. It rewards spectacle. When a preacher on one world burns 1,000 heretics, another seeks to burn 10,000 to prove greater loyalty. When a confessor endures a day of fasting, another endures a month while flayed. As this contest intensifies, so too does the fallout. The destruction of a single heretical cult is no longer sufficient. An entire city must be razed, then a continent, then a world. There are no brakes on this escalation, no incentives for restraint, only glory for those who push further, who purge faster, who declare ever more blasphemies to be unworthy of redemption. The Ministorum's hierarchy fosters this madness. Promotions are not given for wisdom or balance, but for visible, unquestionable acts of devotion. And in a culture where death is sanctity, the bloodier the devotion, the purer it appears. Consider the case of High Prelate Gasimir of Herathion. He began his ministry with passion, preaching to thousands, healing divisions, inspiring faith. But his rise was slow. Other priests, less measured, overtook him by denouncing entire congregations as impure. Gasimir, seeing his path to sainthood slipping, accused the entire industrial caste of his planet of spiritual negligence. Within days, manufactorums were shut down, workers arrested en masse. Thousands were burned. His piety noted, Gasimir was elevated to cardinal, but this was only the beginning. His successor, seeking to surpass Gasimir's record, denounced not just heresy, but insufficient enthusiasm. Shrines were desecrated for failing to maintain sufficient candlelight. Penitent quotas were established. Worshippers were measured by the intensity of their weeping. And when the expected fervor was not met, the purges began again. By the time the spiral concluded, Herathion was a dead world, its population gone, its cities collapsed into dust. Yet both men were canonized. The purity spiral infects not just individuals, but institutions. Ecclesiarchal orders compete with one another to produce the most righteous acts, the most dramatic penances, the most aggressive purifications. The orders' dialogists compete in the identification of hidden heresies. The orders' famulus denounce marriages they once approved. The orders' hospitaller administer curative flames in places where they once gave medicine. There is no incentive to temper this zeal because in the Imperium, questioning excess is its own form of heresy. The spiral is also fed by paranoia. If one cardinal purges a world for a barely justified heresy and is rewarded, others begin to fear being seen as lenient. Leniency becomes a liability. The absence of purges becomes suspicious. "Why has this bishop not burned a village in over a year?" whispers the Voxnet. "Has he grown complacent?" Accusations lead to investigations, investigations to purges, and so the cycle tightens. The spiral can reach truly grotesque extremes. On some worlds, faith is tested by ordeals so violent they border on self-annihilation. Followers are asked to walk through fire, to drink molten wax, to carve litanies into their flesh. Entire communities immolate themselves to prove purity before judgment even arrives. The ecclesiarchy rarely discourages this. Self-sacrifice, after all, is the cornerstone of loyalty. And if such acts prevent the suspicion of heresy, or worse, the arrival of an inquisitor, then the people obey with eager terror. In some cases, planets initiate their own purifications in anticipation of ecclesiarchal visits. They assume judgment will come, so they deliver it first, upon themselves. These acts of preemptive sanctity are praised in sermons throughout the galaxy. The people who burn themselves before being ordered to are held as paragons. The Ministorum does not ask whether this is madness. They record it as glory. This is the unbearable momentum of the purity spiral. Each act of destruction makes the next more inevitable. Each purge becomes the precedent for a greater one. And beneath it all, the quiet truth. No act of faith is ever enough. No planet is ever truly pure. The spiral does not ascend toward heaven. It descends into fire. And at its center, the ecclesiarchy kneels, praising the emperor with bloodied hands, convinced that the next purge will finally bring divine favor, or at least ensure they are not the ones to burn. The purity spiral ensures that the Ministorum will never run out of heretics, because when heretics no longer exist, the faithful become heretical by default. The fire cannot stop, it must consume, because if it ever paused, the ecclesiarchy would be forced to face its own reflection, and see not sanctity, but the madness it has baptized as truth. Beneath the incense and hymns, behind the gilded cathedrals and thunderous sermons, lurks a truth few dare whisper. Planetary purges are not merely acts of faith, they are acts of control. The Ministorum, though swathed in robes and scripture, is not blind to power. It recognizes the practical fruits of flame. The destruction of entire worlds does not just enforce the imperial creed. It resets economies, reshapes power structures, and eliminates inconvenient populations. In the name of sanctity, the ecclesiarchy exerts a devastating form of economic and political domination, and they call it holy. The Imperium's bureaucracy is a behemoth, slow and bloated, held together by inertia and dogma. Resources are scarce. Competition between worlds is fierce. When a planet falls under suspicion of heresy, it often isn't just due to theological deviation, but also because it is no longer economically viable, politically loyal, or socially stable. In these cases, the Ministorum does not merely respond to sin. It leverages it. A dying world becomes a burden. But label it heretical, and you are no longer abandoning it. You are sanctifying its demise. This cold logic is cloaked in religious language. A world failing to meet its tithes is suddenly suspected of spiritual corruption. A governor resistant to ecclesiarchal influence is quietly denounced as a sympathizer of divergent cults. Once the accusation is made, no further proof is needed. The planet is marked, the wheels turn, and soon its annihilation becomes not only permissible, but profitable. By burning such worlds, the Ministorum accomplishes multiple objectives. It reinforces its unchallengeable authority. It eliminates political threats. And perhaps most subtly, it frees up resources, orbital lanes, trade routes, labor contingents, for more compliant systems. The spiritual justification masks a brutal efficiency. Heresy becomes a currency. Declare enough of it, and you can reshape entire sectors under the guise of purification. Take the case of Raxivan Secundus. Officially, the world was condemned for harboring a proto-heresy that blurred the lines between emperor worship and ancestor veneration. But the real story, whispered in dark corners of Segmentum Tempestus, is that Raxivan had begun to default on its adamantium tithe. Its forges, aging and decaying, could not meet quota. When local leaders petitioned for more time, the ecclesiarchy sent not aid, but auditors. Within weeks, a heresy was discovered, and soon after, Exterminatus followed. The tithes were never missed again. They were simply reassigned to more compliant forge worlds. There's also the matter of population control. The Imperium is overflowing with bodies. Hive worlds sprawl with billions, often too many to manage. When unrest grows, when food shortages loom, when rebellion simmers beneath the surface, the Ministorum's solution is theological. The people are declared impure. Their suffering is reframed as moral failure. And when the fires come, they are not called genocide, they are called redemption. The burning of Septical Foy stands as a brutal example. Overcrowded, starved, and plagued with unrest, the hive cities were collapsing under their own weight. The local enforcers could barely contain the chaos. Rather than divert resources to aid them, the ecclesiarchy declared a planetary fast, a religious penance to cleanse the sin of gluttony. Millions died. The survivors, delirious and desperate, turned to strange rituals. These, of course, were labeled heretical, and the final purge was swift. Septigol's ashes now fertilize a shrine moon. Even the planetary nobility are not safe. When dynastic disputes interfere with ecclesiarchal goals, the Ministorum has been known to escalate matters under the banner of piety. Noble houses that oppose temple construction or refuse excessive tithes often find themselves accused of apostasy. Their ancestral homes are razed, their names erased, and their worlds redistributed among more devout heirs. None of this is to say that the ecclesiarchy sees itself as corrupt. Quite the opposite. Its members genuinely believe that these actions serve the emperor's will. The fusion of faith and power is so complete that political expediency is indistinguishable from spiritual righteousness. If a decision increases ecclesiarchal control, it must be right. If it destroys a world but strengthens the creed, it must be holy. And if it benefits the broader Imperium, even marginally, it is not only justified, it is celebrated. This convergence of dogma and exploitation makes the Ministorum's power absolute. It cannot be challenged through logic or appealed through law. To accuse it of manipulation is to commit heresy. To question its motives is to cast doubt upon the divine. And thus, the machinery of destruction turns endlessly, fueled by scripture, lubricated by blood, and justified by the illusion of piety. The Emperor's silence in the face of this devastation is interpreted not as disapproval, but as permission. The ecclesiarchy claims his will in every flame, every scream, every world lost to holy fire. But beneath the incense and the chanting, the truth is inescapable. The Ministorum destroys not only for purity, but for power. And in that power, cloaked in sanctity, lies one of the greatest unspoken horrors of the Imperium. Sometimes the stars themselves weep. There are moments in the ecclesiarchy's long and brutal history when even the most hardened zealots pause, when the smoke of a burned world lingers too long, when the echoes of the condemned seem to reach heaven. These are the rare and haunting instances when the cost of faith is not glory, but silence, not triumph, but sorrow. These are the tales that carve themselves into the collective soul of the Imperium, whispered in corners where the sermons cannot reach, when saints weep for what has been done in their name, and the Ministorum dares for a heartbeat to remember. Among the most infamous of these tragedies is the obliteration of Velian Sanctus. A world of scholars and historians, Velian was devoted utterly to the study of imperial saints, preserving relics and documenting miracles across millennia. But its methods were deemed suspect, too analytical, too inquisitive. When a young canonist visiting the world expressed concern about the critical tone in one of its theological reviews, a spark was lit. That spark became a wildfire. An anonymous report was filed, branding Velian's libraries as intellectually seditious. Within weeks, the Order's Dialogus abandoned the world. The Sisters of Battle descended. The libraries were torched. The population, unarmed and still singing hymns, was vaporized. Afterward, the ecclesiarch himself issued a statement praising the Purification. But among the relics recovered by salvagers was a small, charred shrine, a statue of Saint Oleana, her face melted by heat. And beside it, in scorched script, a prayer she had once spoken. Truth, even when painful, is still his light. That statue now lies in a forbidden vault. The ecclesiarchy does not speak of Velian, but those who were there never forgot, and in quiet moments, some weep for it. The world of Lysira's Gate offers another such tale. Its population had long revered the martyr Saint Lysira, who was said to have tamed warp storms with her prayers. Her followers were peaceful, devout, and deeply ascetic. But a shift in ecclesiarchal doctrine reframed Lysira's original writings. Her teachings were deemed insufficiently militant. Her pacifist tone now read as cowardice. Her veneration became blasphemy. Without warning, her shrines were desecrated. Pilgrims were shot in the streets. The planet, now labeled a heretical cultic center, was eradicated by lance strike. Years later, a group of Sisters Hospitaller who had served on Lysira's Gate requested to be stationed in silence. They took a vow never to speak again, not out of protest, but out of grief. These were not rebels. They were faithful. But their faith had been fractured by what they had seen, and in their silence, they found a form of penance. They remain cloistered in a monastery ship that never docks. These stories are not common in public doctrine, but they persist. They are not told from pulpits, but they are remembered. In the tears of a sister who sees a child flinching at a hymn, in the tremble of a priest's voice as he repeats a sermon too many times. The ecclesiarchy buries such moments beneath its roaring certainties, but even stone can crack beneath the weight of regret. There are saints whose hagiographies contain troubling omissions. Saint Virella the Stern, for instance, once oversaw the purge of 4 hive cities on Bartholomeus Prime. Official records state she acted in response to mass heresy. But personal journals, uncovered centuries later, reveal doubt. Virella wept each night after ordering the purges. She questioned whether the people truly understood the litanies they had failed to repeat. She wondered if ignorance could be heresy. Her doubts were never spoken aloud, but in her final moments, mortally wounded by rebel fire, she whispered, "Emperor, forgive me, for I do not know what they knew." The ecclesiarchy canonized her regardless, but those words remain. Sometimes it is the lay people who carry the burden. On worlds where the ecclesiarchy has overreached, where planets burn too quickly or judgments were issued too carelessly, survivors sometimes gather in secret. They build unauthorized shrines to the unnamed. They light candles not for saints, but for mothers and brothers lost to holy fire. These acts are dangerous. They border on heresy, but they persist. Small acts of mourning in an empire that permits no tears. And what of the emperor? That question, forbidden and silent, haunts even the most devout. Would he have sanctioned this? Does his divine will demand such indiscriminate death? The Ministorum says yes, but others, quietly, tremblingly, are not sure. Some speak of the throne's silence not as approval, but as mourning. That the emperor weeps behind his golden mask, not for a lack of devotion, but for its terrible cost. These are not open heresies. They are not movements. They are moments. Cracks in the cathedral walls, ghosts in the hymns, saints who weep not in anger, but in sorrow. For all the fury and fire, for all the world turned to ash in the name of purity, there lingers, like incense in the ruins, a whisper of doubt, a grief so vast it can only be borne in silence. And in that silence, the truth, that some flames do not purify, they only destroy. Not all who face the Ministorum's wrath do so with bowed heads and clasped hands. Across the Imperium's fractured galaxy, there are those who resist, not always with arms, but with voices, books, and beliefs that will not burn cleanly. The reaction to the Ecclesiarchy's planetary purges is not uniform. It is complex, agonized, and deeply human. Some rebel in fury, others plead for mercy, and a few embrace damnation not as defeat, but as liberation. In these last moments when the flames descend, we see a mirror of ourselves, desperate, proud, terrified, and unyielding. Resistance begins in whispers. A governor questions the legitimacy of a preacher's claims. A scribe notes contradictions in the accusations. A local priest urges his congregation not to panic, to hold fast to their faith. These are not acts of heresy, not yet. But the Ministorum sees doubt as contagion, and such words as symptoms. Once suspicion takes root, resistance often accelerates, not because of guilt, but because the accused realize no defense is possible. They are doomed regardless. So they fight. Not because they hate the Emperor, but because they fear the Ministorum more. When open rebellion erupts, it is often swift and brutal. Planetary militias rally under banners of defiance. Hidden caches are unearthed. Forgotten alliances are remembered. Sometimes the resistance is led by the very clergy the Ministorum seeks to purge. Loyal priests who believe in the Emperor, but not in the madness of his priests. These clerics become spiritual beacons for the doomed, leading last rites and organizing evacuations, even as fire rains from the sky. On Maltesa IV, when the Ministorum declared the populace impure for adopting a localized dialect in their sermons, the entire ecclesiastical order of the planet turned against their masters. They did not deny the Emperor. They worshipped him fiercely, but they refused to accept that linguistic tradition was heresy. The world's final days were spent in furious debate, even as orbital strikes cracked the surface. One priest, Father Halvarin, famously broadcast his final sermon in the native tongue. "If this is heresy," he said, "then heresy is human." These moments of resistance are rarely remembered. The Ecclesiarchy controls the narrative. Inquisitors redact dissent. The records show only that heretics were purged, blasphemies silenced, and purity restored. But in the minds of survivors, and yes, there are sometimes survivors, the truth festers, not as heresy, but as grief, as memory. There are also those who resist not out of loyalty, but desperation. When the Ministorum condemns a planet, the people know what is coming. And when survival is impossible, some turn to forbidden paths, chaos cults, Xenos pacts, radical doctrines. If the Emperor's mercy is not coming, then perhaps someone else's is. This transformation is often used by the Ecclesiarchy to justify its actions. "See," they say, "we were right." But they were not. They made monsters by declaring humans monstrous. They provoked the very corruption they claim to prevent. Others choose symbolic resistance. Artists paint murals of forbidden saints. Poets write verses that mourn the uncanonized dead. Mothers name their children after martyrs unrecognized by terror. These acts are as dangerous as open war. The Ecclesiarchy fears symbols as much as swords. They erase such gestures with fire, but still they persist. For in the last hours, when all else is lost, the soul must speak. Inquisitorial archives, sealed and buried, contain transcripts of intercepted final messages. A child begging the Emperor to save her school. A teacher reciting the entire Catechism of Light even as the sky turns red. A planetary leader saying, "We die loyal." These are not the words of heretics. They are the final cries of the faithful, unheard and unmourned. And there are, too, the traitors, the truly heretical, the ones who spit upon the creed, who desecrate temples and mock the saints. Some do so out of hatred, others because they once believed and were betrayed. Their rage is molten, their defiance absolute. They scream that the emperor is dead, that faith is a lie, that the Ministorum is a cancer. They are not correct, but they are not entirely wrong. In their fury, there is a reflection of the ecclesiarchy's own fire. They are two sides of the same purifying madness. And what of the Ministorum itself? Do its agents ever hear these cries? Do they listen to the defiance, the prayers, the songs sung as death approaches? Perhaps some do. Perhaps a sister of battle pauses as a child offers her a flower. Perhaps a cardinal hesitates as he sees the faith in the eyes of those he has condemned. But if such moments occur, they are buried, forgotten. For the Ministorum cannot allow resistance to be real. It must always be heresy. Otherwise, the fire is not justice, it is murder. Resistance in the face of planetary destruction is not futile, it is human. It is the soul's final stand against the unrelenting machinery of blind belief. And in that resistance, there is a quiet, terrible beauty, not because it succeeds, but because it dares to exist at all. The Emperor does not speak. He sits unmoving upon the golden throne, a corpse god in all but name, sustained by endless sacrifice and unyielding faith. And yet, his silence is louder than any sermon. Every day, across 1,000,000 worlds, the Ministorum claims to know his will. They say he desires purity. They say he demands fire. They say that when a planet is burned, it is by his command. But the Emperor has never confirmed this. He has never spoken from the throne. He has never said, "Yes, burn them." His silence is a void into which the ecclesiarchy pours its madness. And that is the tragedy. Because what if his silence is not consent, but sorrow? There are those, whispered heretics, unspoken philosophers, perhaps even a few inquisitors, who wonder whether the Emperor weeps behind the mask of divinity. They ask if the fire that consumes the faithful is not divine judgment, but a perversion of his dream. They ask whether the Imperium he envisioned, unity, survival, hope, has become a twisted parody of his intent, choked in incense and drowning in blood. The Ministorum cannot allow these questions. They have built an empire upon answers. Their faith is a monolith, and doubt is its only true enemy. And so, they speak for him. They interpret his will through ancient texts, through the visions of madmen, through the fire-lit eyes of zealots who see heresy in shadows. They proclaim certainty because uncertainty would crack the creed's foundation. But the Emperor does not confirm them. He does not rise. He does not command. And so they burn and burn and burn. It is perhaps the cruelest irony that the being who most understood humanity, who led it with wisdom, who sought to free it from superstition, is now worshipped in the most superstitious manner imaginable. The ecclesiarchy turned his silence into scripture, his death into a divine machine, his dream into a nightmare wrapped in gold. They claim his judgment in every purge, yet he offers no reply, and perhaps he cannot, or perhaps he will not. There are moments in the quiet places of the Imperium where this contradiction surfaces. A sister of battle, hardened in flame, stands over the corpse of a child who sang hymns until the last breath. A missionary weeps alone in the ruins of a town raised for a prayer variant he did not understand. A confessor dreams of the Emperor, not as a god, but as a man, and in that dream, he turns away. These are fleeting, dangerous thoughts, but they are real, and they are growing, because even the most faithful sometimes ask, is this what he wanted? Was the God Emperor of mankind born to sanctify the deaths of trillions? Did he rise to power so that priests might play with worlds like chess pieces? Did he dream of unity only to see his followers tear each other apart in the name of pure belief? Or is the silence of the throne, his final protest, his last eternal refusal to bless the flames. The ecclesiarchy insists that the fire is love, that the burning of worlds is the cleansing breath of divinity. But love does not kill indiscriminately. Love does not erase names, rewrite histories, and celebrate annihilation. Love does not demand total submission under pain of orbital bombardment. Whatever the Emperor was, warlord, genius, visionary, he was not this. But the Ministorum does not need the Emperor to speak. They need only that he remains silent. For in that silence, they find justification. In his stillness, they find license. And in his absence, they see only opportunity. So the purges continue. The sermons never stop. Planets vanish into fire, and each time the ecclesiarchy says, "This is his will." And still the Emperor says nothing. This is the great unanswered question at the heart of the Imperium. What if he does not approve? What if all this, the pyres, the screams, the ash-choked void, is not salvation, but tragedy? If so, then the Imperium is not the Emperor's dream. It is his tomb, and we, the faithful, are burying him with every world we burn.